Welcome to Sign Facts, where every movie hides a secret. Every scene tells a deeper story. And every frame contains details most viewers never notice, from legendary blockbusters and mind-bending science fiction to dark thrillers, unforgettable horror, and hidden cinematic gems. We explore the facts, theories, Easter eggs, behind-the-scenes secrets, and untold stories that make movies truly unforgettable. This isn't just watching movies, this is discovering what lies beneath them. Subscribe to Sign Facts, and step beyond the screen. Django names the three men Schultz is hunting: Big John, Ellis, and Roger, the last one better known as Little Rog. He tells Schultz these men used to work as overseers on the Carucan plantation, back when he belonged to that same owner. Schultz cuts in to correct him. The Brittle brothers aren't overseers anymore, they're fugitives now, with bounties on their heads, and Schultz has come to track them down. The only thing that matters to him is whether Django would recognize their faces on sight. Before Django can even answer, Ace jumps in and orders Schultz to stop talking to him. As far as Ace is concerned, Django is property, and no stranger gets to address him without permission. Schultz stays calm and explains he's here to make a legitimate offer. He wants to buy Django, and he's willing to pay a fair price for him. Ace flatly refuses, and his hostility escalates fast when Schultz doesn't back down. Eventually Ace pulls his gun and points it straight at Schultz. Unfazed, Schultz asks him plainly whether he's bluffing or actually planning to shoot. Ace makes it clear he means it, so Schultz doesn't wait around. He draws his own hidden pistol in a single motion and fires, and the bullet catches Ace in the head before he can react. Schultz fires again immediately, this time hitting Dickie's horse. The animal goes down and pins Dickie beneath it. Trapped and in agony, Dickie screams in pain and rage while Schultz strolls toward him without a hint of urgency. With biting sarcasm, Schultz apologizes for shooting the horse, explaining he simply couldn't risk Dickie doing anything rash before they'd had a chance to talk things through. When Dickie keeps howling, Schultz politely asks him to quiet down. He still has business to finish with Django, and the noise is making conversation difficult. He turns back to the chained men and picks up right where he left off. Django confirms he'd know the Brittle brothers if he saw them again. That's all Schultz needs to hear. He tells the injured Dickie he'll be purchasing Django for a fair sum, leaves the payment behind, collects the paperwork, and the sale is done. He has no interest in running the Speck brothers' operation, though before riding off, he unlocks the rest of the chained prisoners and leaves Dickie's fate entirely in their hands. The freedmen close in around the trapped slave trader, now armed with his own weapons. Schultz doesn't stick around to watch what happens next. Django strips Ace's coat off him, claims his horse, and rides out alongside Schultz. By the next day, the two of them reach the small Texas town of Daughtry, and their arrival turns heads immediately. Townsfolk stare out from windows and porches. Nobody there has ever seen a black man riding freely on horseback, let alone next to a white one. When Django and Schultz walk into the saloon, the innkeeper panics the moment he spots Django and bolts out the door to fetch the law. With the place empty, Schultz simply steps behind the bar and pours himself a drink while he lays out the real reason he bought Django. He describes bounty hunting as a trade that, in its own way, profits from death. Much like slave trading profits from human lives, except bounty hunters get paid for handing wanted men over to the law, usually after killing them. He admits openly that he despises slavery, but he's also willing to use Django's legal status as a tool to get what he needs. The problem is that Schultz has never laid eyes on the Brittle brothers, while Django knows exactly what they look like. So here's his proposal: help him find and identify the three fugitives, and once they're caught, Django gets to be the one who kills them. In exchange, Schultz will grant him his freedom and pay him $75. It's an offer that means more than simple revenge. Freedom would finally let Django go looking for his wife, Broomhilda. He agrees, and the two set off together. As they ride, Schultz asks what Django plans to do once he's free. Django tells him he means to find Broomhilda and buy her freedom too. Schultz is caught off guard to learn Django is married, and even more intrigued once he hears his wife's full name, Broomhilda von Schaft. The name catches his attention immediately because it's German. Django explains she was raised by German-speaking owners from the von Schaft family, and since she worked inside their house, she picked up a bit of the language. Her name comes straight out of an old German legend, an unexpected thread connecting Schultz to the woman Django is so desperate to find. For now, though, their focus stays on the Brittle brothers. The trail points toward Tennessee, where Schultz believes the men are working on a plantation. Before they arrive, the two stop to prepare a cover story, since they can't just show up announcing they're hunting 3 plantation workers, especially with Django now riding as a free man beside Schultz. They decide to pose as businessmen, with Django playing the role of Schultz's valet and personal servant along for an important deal. The disguise should let them walk the grounds, size up the workers, and search for the Brittle brothers without tipping their hand. To sell the act, Django needs the right clothes, and Schultz tells him to pick out whatever he likes. After a lifetime of being told what to wear, where to stand, and how to act, Django is finally handed a real choice of his own, and he takes his time picking out an outfit, a small but meaningful step toward the freedom that will let him start his search for Broomhilda in earnest. Schultz and Django soon reach the Tennessee plantation owned by Spencer Big Daddy Bennett. To get inside without raising suspicion, Schultz pretends he wants to buy one of Bennett's enslaved workers. Big Daddy, smelling a profitable sale, welcomes them in eagerly. Since Schultz says he wants to look the place over before talking business, Bennett assigns a house servant named Bettina to show Django around the estate. Django's strange clothes and self-assured manner leave her unsure how to treat him. He's black, yet he rides freely, carries a weapon, and travels alongside a wealthy white man. Django makes it clear she should simply treat him as someone with authority for the time being. As Bettina leads him across the sprawling estate, Django quietly asks if she's ever heard of the Brittle brothers. She hasn't, but once Django describes them in more detail, hoping something about their looks or manner will ring a bell, she realizes he might be talking about 3 men on the plantation who go by the name Chaffee. They showed up a while back and now work for Big Daddy. Her description lines up exactly with what Django's expecting. Now the Brittle brothers have simply taken new names. She tells him Ellis is out working the fields somewhere, while the other 2 are near the stables, punishing a young enslaved woman named Jody for breaking some eggs. The instant he hears that, Django's composure disappears. He tells Bettina to find Schultz and bring him to the stables, then heads there alone. When he arrives, he finds Big John and Little Raj tormenting Jody, and the sight drags up painful memories of what he and Broomhilda once suffered under these same men. This isn't just a bounty anymore, it's personal. Django steps forward and confronts them, and Big John barely registers what's happening before Django shoots him dead. Little Raj lunges at him, but Django knocks him down and beats him savagely, years of pent-up rage pouring out all at once. When Little Raj reaches for a weapon, Django ends it, firing several shots into him. Schultz arrives just as it's over and looks down at the bodies, asking only whether these are 2 of the wanted Brittle brothers. Django confirms it, then points toward the fields. Ellis, the last one, is already running for his life. Schultz calmly raises his rifle, takes aim across the plantation, and drops Ellis before he can get away. The gunfire brings Big Daddy and his men running, and Bennett is furious that 2 visitors have just killed 3 of his white employees on his own land. Schultz produces the official wanted posters proving the Brittle brothers were fugitives with legal bounties on their heads. As a licensed bounty hunter, he had every right to kill them. Bennett has no real recourse but to let the 2 men leave. That night, though, he rounds up a large posse of armed riders. Under crude cloth masks, the group rides out under cover of darkness, determined to hunt down and kill Schultz and Django despite the legal papers they'd been shown earlier. From a distance, Schultz and Django watch them approach the camp. Schultz has been expecting this. Before leaving the plantation, He'd warned Bennett that attacking an officer of the court in the middle of his duties could mean the death penalty. Bennett dismissed the warning, confident that the sheer size of his posse made him untouchable. The masked riders surround Schultz's old dental wagon, convinced their targets are hiding in or near it. In reality, Schultz and Django are watching safely from a hillside above the road. Schultz has rigged the wagon with explosives, and once the posse closes in, he takes aim and fires. The shot triggers a massive explosion that obliterates the wagon and sends the attackers scattering in chaos. Several riders die instantly, the rest flee in every direction. Big Daddy survives the blast and gallops off into the dark, but Schultz hands the rifle to Django and tells him to finish it. Django lines up the shot, tracks Bennett through the sights, and fires as the bullet knocks him off his horse and ends the chase for good. Later, sitting by the campfire and recovering from the day's violence, the two men's conversation drifts back to Broomhilda. Schultz explains that her name comes from an old German legend, in which a princess named Broomhilda is trapped on a mountain ringed by fire, waiting for a hero brave enough to cross the flames and rescue her. He tells the story with real enthusiasm, partly to entertain Django, and partly because he can't help noticing how closely it mirrors Django's own situation. Broomhilda has been taken somewhere beyond his reach, and now Django has to become the hero who finds her. The parallel clearly lands with both of them. Schultz also recognizes that simply setting Django loose to head to Greenville alone would be reckless. He has no money, no legal protection, and no idea where his wife was even taken. Trying to rescue her unprepared would likely get him killed. So Schultz proposes a partnership. Django stays with him through the winter and learns the bounty hunting trade, earning a third of every reward they bring in. By the time the snow melts, he should have the money and the experience to go after Broomhilda properly, and Schultz promises to personally travel with him to Greenville to dig through the slave traders' sale records and find out who bought her. Django accepts. The two head back to Texas and start working together as bounty hunters. Their first job together is tracking down a wanted outlaw named Smitty Bacall and his gang. Django takes the shot himself, positioning the rifle, studying his target, and killing Smitty from a distance. After they collect the reward, he keeps the wanted poster as a memento of his first successful bounty. Schultz keeps training him how to read handbills, track fugitives, identify targets, and hold his nerve before pulling the trigger. Django also sharpens his aim by shooting at a snowman, getting faster and more confident with every round. All winter, the pair travel from town to town, collecting one bounty after another, and Django proves to be a natural marksman. By spring, he's a different man entirely from the shackled prisoner Schultz found in Texas. Confident in the saddle, fluent in the trade, and unshaken by dangerous criminals. He and Schultz have made good money and taken down several wanted men. With winter behind them, they finally turn their attention to Broomhilda, and their search leads them into Mississippi, where slavery's scale and brutality are even more visible. Enslaved people crowding the streets, plantations stretching for miles, human beings bought and sold in the open. Digging through sale records, they discover Broomhilda now belongs to Calvin Candie, the wealthy owner of Candyland, one of the largest cotton plantations in the state, an estate known as much for its size as for Candie's cruelty and extravagance. Django's first impulse is to ride straight to Candyland and offer to buy her outright, but Schultz shoots the idea down immediately. If Candie realizes Broomhilda has personal value to Django, he'll either refuse to sell her or demand an outrageous price. They need a reason to get onto the property without revealing what they're really after. So Schultz comes up with something far more elaborate. Instead of trying to buy an ordinary worker, they'll pose as wealthy buyers looking to acquire a Mandingo fighter, Candie's term for the enslaved men he forces to fight each other, sometimes to the death, purely for entertainment. Schultz figures Candie's obsession with the sport can be turned against him. Under the plan, Schultz will play a wealthy businessman from De 1/4 Settlerf looking to break into the Mandingo fighting business, While Django poses as his expert, someone trained to judge the strength and value of potential fighters. Their fake offer needs to be big enough to grab Candie's attention, so Schultz plans to open negotiations at $12,000 for one of Candie's best fighters, a far above market price, which should be more than enough to earn them an invitation to Candyland. Once inside, they figure they can quietly track down Broomhilda and buy her for a fraction of that, all without tipping Candie off to the real reason for their visit. Schultz and Django set up a meeting with Candie at a private gentleman's club, where they find him watching two enslaved fighters locked in a brutal match while wealthy spectators drink, gamble, and treat the violence as pure entertainment. Django forces himself to show no discomfort. His role demands he act like someone used to this kind of brutality, so even though the fight sickens him, he keeps a cold expression and studies the fighters as if they were merchandise rather than people. After the match, Schultz introduces himself and gets down to business, explaining that he's after an exceptional fighter and might be willing to pay $12,000 for the right one. The number alone is enough to hook Candie. A few people spend that kind of money on a single enslaved fighter, and he immediately sees the potential for a huge profit. Django backs up the act by playing arrogant and speaking with practiced authority about judging Mandingo fighters, which convinces Candie the offer is genuine. Intrigued, Candie invites them both to Candyland to inspect his fighters in person. The next day, as the group prepares to leave, Schultz finds a moment alone with Django to remind him that Broomhilda is somewhere on the plantation and to warn him not to let his emotions show when he sees her. If Django gets reckless or tries to act on the spot, their entire cover falls apart, and reaching her at all depends on Candie continuing to believe they're only there for the fighters. Django assures him he understands. They set off toward Candyland with Candie, his associates, and several armed trackers, and along the way the group stumbles onto a disturbing scene in the woods. Candie's trackers have just captured an escaped Mandingo fighter named D'Artagnan, surrounded by hunting dogs and too exhausted to run again. The man has been battered by repeated fights and begs Candie for mercy, saying he can't continue. Candie forces him to kneel and explain his last match and learns D'Artagnan lost. He shows no concern for the man's injuries or suffering, only fury that he's paid good money for a fighter who's no longer profitable, lecturing him about the loss as though he were a failed investment rather than a human being. Schultz, visibly disturbed, offers to reimburse Candie for the money he's lost on D'Artagnan. Django cuts in fast, knowing Schultz's sympathy could blow their cover. A man supposedly buying fighters for deadly combat wouldn't suddenly risk the whole deal over one escaped slave. So Django coldly argues that D'Artagnan is Candie's property to do with as he pleases. Candie, watching Django's reaction, seems impressed by his apparent lack of feeling, and asks whether Django would object if the trackers finished D'Artagnan off right there. Django says he has no objection, and Candie orders the dogs released. Schultz is forced to stand silent as the dogs tear the man apart, his screams echoing through the trees while Candie and his men watch, unbothered. Django watches too, burying every trace of anger behind the ruthless persona he's built. One emotional slip could unravel the whole plan and doom Broomhilda before he ever reaches her. Once it's over, Candie carries on toward Candyland as if nothing had happened. When the group arrives, Candie's elderly house servant Stephen comes out to greet his master and freezes at the sight of Django riding alongside the white guests. It's an image that clearly offends and confuses him. In Stephen's world, no black man should be allowed onto the property on horseback, let alone dressed like a gentleman and carrying himself with such confidence. Candie explains that Django is a free man and an important part of Schultz's business, ordering Stephen to compose himself and treat the guests with respect. Stephen obeys, but keeps a wary, suspicious eye on Django from that moment on. Once they've settled in, Schultz casually asks Candie to have Broomhilda cleaned up and brought to see him, claiming he's heard she speaks German and would enjoy the chance to converse in his native language. Candie agrees without a second thought, calling her by the nickname Hildy and telling his servants to prepare her. Django soon learns that Broomhilda has recently been punished for trying to escape locked inside a small underground box out in the brutal Mississippi heat. Hearing this nearly shatters the composure he's fought so hard to maintain. When the servants finally pull her out of the cramped metal chamber, he sees her exhausted, terrified, and barely able to stand, and his hand almost moves for his gun before he catches himself. He's come too far to lose control now. Any sudden reaction would give away just how much she means to him. He forces himself to stay still as she's carried off, cleaned up, and prepared to meet Schultz. That evening, Candie's widowed sister, Laura Lee, brings Broomhilda to Schultz's room. Schultz greets her warmly and switches to German, explaining that it buys them a small measure of privacy since few people at Candyland can follow the language. At first Broomhilda is nervous, assuming Schultz is just another buyer, but he quickly reassures her he means no harm. He's planning to purchase her under the guise that she's simply a companion for him during the negotiations, when in truth the whole Mandingo deal is a front. He and his partner came to Candyland specifically to find her and get her out. Confused why a stranger would take such a risk, she asks who his companion really is, and Schultz steps aside to let Django in. The moment Broomhilda sees her husband, she's overcome, barely able to believe he's really standing there. Django approaches gently, confirming he's finally found her after months of searching. But their reunion has to stay quiet. Schultz warns them both that Candie can't learn about the marriage until the sale is finalized, or he'll either refuse to sell her or use the knowledge to demand an outrageous price. So Django and Broomhilda separate again before anyone grows suspicious. At dinner, Schultz continues playing the wealthy buyer while Django maintains his hard, detached persona as the Mandingo expert. Broomhilda is brought into the room and does her best to act like Django is a stranger to her. Their performance fools most of the table, but not Steven. He notices the small things, how Broomhilda reacts when Laura Lee makes an offhand comment about Django, the brief glances passing between them, and he becomes convinced their connection isn't accidental. He finds an excuse to pull Candie aside and tells him privately that Schultz has no real interest in a Mandingo fighter, and the $12,000 offer is just a way to get onto the property, and the true reason for the visit is Broomhilda. Candie's skeptical at first, but Steven lays out how obviously Django and Broomhilda know each other, and once Candie sees it too, his hospitality vanishes. Back at the table, Laura Lee keeps talking with Broomhilda, which buys Django time to keep his composure and stalls Candie and Steven from confronting her immediately. Eventually Candie clears the room, leaving only Django, Schultz, his lawyer, and a few trusted men. The mood shifts instantly. Candie reveals he knows the truth, that the whole negotiation over a fighter called Eskimo Joe was never real. It was only a means to buy Broomhilda cheap. Steven drags her into the room, gripping her roughly by the throat, and Candie uses her fear to make it clear he's now in control. Rather than shutting the deal down, Candie offers new terms. He'll still sell her, but not at the discount price Schultz had planned. He wants the full $12,000 that was supposedly reserved for the fighter. His armed men surround the room to make clear this isn't up for negotiation. Schultz tries to push back, but Candie forces Broomhilda over the table, produces a hammer, and threatens to crush her skull if Schultz refuses. Django stays perfectly still, knowing any movement could get her killed on the spot. Left with no choice, Schultz agrees and hands over the money, letting Candie believe he's won. The papers are drawn up, and Broomhilda is officially sold to Schultz. Technically, the mission is complete. All that's left is for Candie to hand over the documents and let them leave. But Candie can't resist one last humiliation. He extends his hand and insists Schultz shake it to seal the deal. Schultz refuses. After everything he's just witnessed, the staged fights, D'Artagnan's death, the treatment of Broomhilda, he can't bring himself to offer even a hollow gesture of respect. Candie insists the deal isn't final without it, once again dangling Broomhilda's safety as leverage. Schultz stares at Candie's outstretched hand and realizes there's only one thing he can live with doing. He apologizes to Django, pulls a hidden pistol from his sleeve, and shoots Candie point blank in the chest. Candie drops, mortally wounded, and his bodyguard, Butch Pooch, reacts instantly, firing his rifle into Schultz and killing him before he can escape. Django doesn't hesitate. He grabs his weapons, kills Pooch, then turns his guns on Candie's lawyer and the armed men filling the room, sparking a full-blown firefight through the mansion. He moves from room to room, using doors, furniture, and bodies for cover, dropping one guard after another, and for a moment it looks like he might be able to fight his way through all of them. But his ammunition starts running low, and Steven and Billy Crash get to Broomhilda first, pressing a gun to her and threatening to kill her unless Django surrenders. He has no choice. He drops his weapon and lets them take him. By the next day, Django is strung up naked and upside down in a storage room while Billy Crash prepares to torture and castrate him, clearly relishing the description of what's coming. Before he can start, Steven arrives with new orders. Laura Lee, now running Candyland after her brother's death, has decided killing Django outright would be too merciful. Instead, she wants him sold to the LaQuint Mining Company, notorious for working enslaved men to death. Once he's there, he'll spend what's left of his life underground breaking rocks, a fate Steven gleefully describes as worse than execution, promising Django will vanish and never see Broomhilda again. Not long after, Django is chained with a group of other enslaved men and marched off toward the mining company under armed guard. Refusing to accept his story is over, he starts working on the men escorting him during the journey, claiming he's not an ordinary slave but a professional bounty hunter who was wrongfully captured. The guards laugh him off until he produces a handbill he's kept since his first bounty with Schultz, a proof that he knows details only a real bounty hunter would recognize. He spins a story, telling them the wanted men on the handbill are hiding at Candyland, and that the reward is big enough to make every man in the escort rich if they'll take him back there and split it. The guards are wary, but the other chained prisoners back him up, confirming he acts nothing like an ordinary field hand and clearly understands weapons and bounty work. Greed wins out over caution. They unchain him and hand him a rifle to lead them to the supposed fugitives. The instant he's armed, Django turns the gun on them, kills the guards, frees himself completely, and takes their weapons, horses, and dynamite, leaving the rest of the chained men to make their own escape while he rides back toward Candyland. He's determined to rescue Broomhilda, avenge Schultz, and punish everyone connected to D'Artagnan's death. His first stop is the Trackers' camp, where the men responsible for setting the dogs on D'Artagnan are relaxing, unaware he's coming. Before they can react, he kills the Trackers and their dogs, then heads for the barn where Schultz's body has been left. He searches his friend and finds Broomhilda's signed freedom papers, taking them so no one can ever claim ownership of her again. Before he leaves, Django pauses beside Schultz and quietly says goodbye, resting a hand on his head. Schultz started out as a stranger who simply needed his help, but became his teacher, his partner, and his closest friend. Without him, Django would never have gained the skill or freedom to make it this far. Now he means to finish what they started together. With most of Candyland's residents away at Candie's funeral, Django slips toward the small building where Broomhilda is being held, kills the guards, and frees her, showing her the papers proving she's legally his wife and a free woman. He hides her somewhere safe, then returns to the mansion to wait for the rest. By nightfall, Laura Lee, Steven, Billy Crash, and the remaining armed men return from the funeral, convinced Django is already on his way to the mining company and expecting no trouble. Instead, he's waiting for them inside, dressed now in Candie's own clothes and armed to the teeth. Billy reaches for his gun, but Django shoots him first. The other guards fall moments later. Laura Lee tries to run, but Django fires and sends her flying through the doorway. That leaves only Steven and two enslaved house servants. Django tells the two women they're free to go, giving them a moment to say their goodbyes to Laura Lee and to the ruined Candie household before they leave. Steven refuses to budge, even now hurling insults at Django and insisting he'll never really be free. Django shoots him in both knees, leaving him crippled on the floor, then reveals he's rigged the mansion with dynamite. Steven's bravado collapses instantly, and he screams after Django as he walks out, begging him to stop. Django ignores him. Once he's at a safe distance, he lights the fuse, and the explosives tear through the mansion in a massive fireball. Steven disappears into the wreckage as the house that once symbolized Candie's wealth and cruelty collapses in on itself. From a nearby hillside, Broomhilda watches the plantation burn. Django rides up to join her, and the two share a quiet moment after everything they've survived. She smiles as he shows off a little on horseback, savoring the freedom he fought so hard to win. Together, they turn their backs on the burning ruins of Candyland and ride off into the night. Django starts the story as a man walking through Texas in chains. He ends it as a free man riding beside his wife, armed, self-assured, and feared by anyone unwise enough to cross him, a soon to be remembered as one of the fastest guns around. The quickest way to spot Django Unchained as a Quentin Tarantino film is that nearly every scene feels filtered through his personal video collection. The Western trappings are obvious, but he's not interested in a clean, traditional Western. He pulls from spaghetti westerns, blaxploitation, grindhouse cinema, and old revenge tales, then jams them all into the same movie until they cohere into something unmistakably his own. That's why Western only tells part of the story, since most of the action unfolds in the American South rather than the traditional frontier. Southern might be the more accurate label. His characters wear the hats, carry the guns, and make entrances like classic Western gunslingers, but the world around them is built on plantations, slavery, and the social order of the pre-Civil War South. Tarantino makes his intentions clear almost immediately, using the visual language of a Western to tell a story rooted somewhere else entirely, geographically and historically. The old-fashioned studio logo, the bright red opening credits, and the original Django theme song aren't subtle nods. They're announcements of exactly which shelf of film history he's drawing from. Even Franco Nero, star of the 1966 original, shows up for a brief exchange built around the pronunciation of Django's name, a small joke, but a telling one. Tarantino isn't remaking the earlier film or continuing its story, he's acknowledging it, borrowing its aura, and then heading in a completely different direction. That kind of reference-heavy filmmaking can wear thin when it starts to feel like a director showing off his collection, but here, most of it earns its place in the world he's building. The dramatic zooms, theatrical entrances, exaggerated costumes, and sudden bursts of violence all belong to the same heightened reality. Nothing about the film is restrained. A restraint was never really the point. Tarantino wants Django to feel larger than life, wants Schultz to sound like he's wandered in from a more sophisticated picture, and wants Candie's plantation to feel both historically grounded and strangely theatrical, like a stage built for an inevitable act of revenge. The result reads less like a recreation of the past and more like a fantasy assembled from other movies. Historical accuracy often takes a backseat to visual impact, as some of the costuming feels designed more for a Western icon than for a man actually living in the South of 1858. Django's wardrobe becomes part of his transformation, and Tarantino clearly understands that a striking silhouette can say more than a page of dialogue. A free black man on horseback with a gun at his side is a deliberately impossible image for that society, and the film treats it with the same excitement another movie might reserve for a superhero's arrival. Then there's the dialogue, another Tarantino trademark that's grown harder to separate from his self-indulgence over the years. His earlier films had long conversations too, but they usually felt sharp enough that every pause carried weight. By this point in his career, those scenes have started to stretch. Characters don't just exchange information, they perform. Schultz circles a point with impeccable manners. Candie clearly enjoys the sound of his own voice. Steven watches, interrupts, and slowly seizes control of the room. When these scenes work, they're riveting, because violence always feels close at hand. A polite sentence can turn into a threat halfway through, A business deal can suddenly expose who understands the situation and who doesn't. Tarantino has a gift for letting people talk while quietly shifting the balance of power between them. But there are moments where the talking feels like Tarantino simply enjoying his own writing a bit too much. The film occasionally pauses because a scene amuses him, not because the story needs it. The masked traders bickering about their badly cut eye holes is a perfect example. Some viewers count it among the funniest scenes in the movie, others see it as a long detour involving characters who vanish immediately after. Both reactions are fair. It's pure Tarantino way funny, oddly specific, a little overextended, and confident the audience will follow wherever he leads. The soundtrack follows the same instinct. The vintage Western scores tied the film directly to its inspirations, while the modern tracks deliberately shatter any illusion of historical purity. That combination works brilliantly in some scenes, making Django's rise feel immediate rather than trapped behind museum glass. In others, the collision is distracting. A hip-hop track playing over Western imagery reads either as inspired reinvention or jarring interruption, depending on how willing you are to play by Tarantino's rules. That's really the whole experience of watching this film. Tarantino borrows constantly, yet the finished product never feels anonymous. The influences are visible, sometimes aggressively so, but the mixture is entirely his. Few directors would even attempt to combine slavery, broad comedy, Italian Western scores, modern rap, extended monologues, and cartoonish gunfights, and fewer still could make those pieces feel like they belong in the same world. The film's flaws come from that same confidence. Tarantino rarely seems willing to cut an idea just because the movie would be tighter without it. His own cameo is the clearest example. Surrounded by a cast this strong, his acting feels awkward and out of place, yet he includes himself anyway, a reminder that this film is controlled by a director who likes leaving his fingerprints everywhere. Even so, that total lack of anonymity is one of its greatest strengths. Whether a given scene is brilliant, excessive, or both, it never feels like it could have come from anyone else. Django Unchained may be built from decades of genre cinema, but the final product is unmistakably Tarantino. Knowledgeable, provocative, funny, violent, and just self-indulgent enough to occasionally test even a sympathetic audience's patience. It's entertaining, and the story tracks a man who starts with almost no control over where he's going or what happens to him. Django is chained to a line of enslaved men being marched through the cold by the Speck brothers when Dr. King Schultz appears out of nowhere with a bizarre dentist's wagon and an even stranger way of talking. Schultz is hunting 3 wanted men called the Brittle brothers, and Django is the only person who can identify them. Their first meeting isn't exactly heroic. Schultz doesn't free Django out of some sudden impulse to rescue a stranger. He needs information. Django has it, and buying him outright is simply the fastest legal route to getting it. The relationship begins as a transaction, and that matters, because the film lets it develop gradually instead of pretending the 2 men trust each other right away. Schultz lays out a clear deal: help find the Brittle brothers, and Django gets his freedom, a horse, and a cut of the reward. Django takes it, because there's no real downside. He's gone from being treated as property to being asked for what he knows. Even with Schultz still holding all the cards, it's the first time in his life anyone has offered him something resembling a choice. The hunt for the Brittle brothers gives the film its first clean mission. Django recognizes the men who abused him in Broomhilda, while Schultz supplies the legal cover that lets him kill them and get paid for it. It's revenge dressed up as official business, and Django adapts to the arrangement fast. The idea that he can hunt down white men and be rewarded for it almost feels unreal to him. For the audience, it's an early signal of the much bigger power reversal the film is building toward. Once that job wraps up, Schultz could easily cut Django loose and move on. Instead, he makes another offer: stay through the winter, learn the trade, and take home a third of everything they earn. When the season ends, Schultz will help him track down Broomhilda. This is where the film slows down and lets the partnership become more than a plot device. Schultz teaches him to shoot, how to approach wanted men, and how to survive in a world where most people are disturbed just by the sight of a free black man on horseback. Django, meanwhile, proves useful for reasons that go far beyond recognizing three faces. He learns fast, keeps his nerve, and gradually starts operating as Schultz's equal rather than his assistant. The bounty hunting stretch is fairly episodic. They travel, track fugitives, set traps, and cash rewards. Some of it could probably have been trimmed without hurting the larger story, but it serves a real purpose beyond target practice. We need to watch Django become genuinely capable. If the movie jumped straight from his freedom to the rescue at Candyland, his transformation into a skilled gunslinger would feel too convenient. The winner buys him experience, money, and maybe most important, confidence, while also giving the film room to build the chemistry between him and Schultz. Schultz does most of the talking, naturally, turning even a simple explanation into a small performance, while Django mostly watches and speaks only when necessary. That contrast creates an easy, comfortable rhythm. Schultz knows how to work a room through language. Django learns to read one before he acts. Their friendship never gets a big sentimental scene. It shows up in smaller choices instead. Schultz takes Django seriously when he says Broomhilda is still enslaved. He could easily write off the rescue as too risky, hand Django his share of the money, and send him off alone. Instead, he becomes personally invested. By the time they start searching for her, the original business arrangement has basically disappeared. Schultz is helping now because he genuinely wants Django to succeed. Actually finding Broomhilda turns out to be the easy part. Schultz uses his contacts to learn she's been sold to Calvin Candie, owner of the Mississippi plantation Candyland. Getting her out is the real challenge. Django can't simply show up and offer to buy her. An enslaved woman with no obvious market value could suddenly become very expensive the moment Candie senses how badly they want her, and any hint of emotion between Django and Broomhilda could blow their cover before the deal even closes. So Schultz devises a scheme far more elaborate than the situation strictly calls for, which is very much in character for both him and the movie. He and Django pretend to be shopping for a Mandingo fighter. Schultz as the wealthy buyer throwing around absurd money, Django as a hardened black slave trader evaluating fighters on behalf of white clients. It's an ugly disguise, especially for Django, since it requires him to act with genuine cruelty toward other enslaved people. But that cruelty is exactly what sells the act. A visibly sympathetic Django would never pass as part of that world. The fake offer works. Candie, who loves money and spectacle and the chance to impress wealthy strangers, invites them to Candyland. From the outside, the plan seems to be running like clockwork. They're on the property, Broomhilda is nearby, and Candie believes he's negotiating a massive sale. The tension comes from how much can go wrong without a single shot fired. Django has to stay emotionally unreadable when he sees his wife. Schultz has to keep Candie interested without actually committing to the fake purchase, and Broomhilda has to play along without giving away that she knows either man. Every conversation becomes a performance, and one wrong look could bring the whole thing down. Candie is dangerous, but he's not the one who first senses something's wrong. That's Steven. While Candie enjoys Schultz's attention and daydreams about the money, Steven watches Django and Broomhilda far more closely, noticing the familiarity between them and sensing that Django's behavior doesn't quite match the identity he's presenting. That discovery changes everything, until Steven tips off Candie. The plan runs on deception and patience. Once he does, the negotiation turns into a trap. Candie stops trying to impress his guests and starts making them pay for trying to deceive him. The film takes its time getting to this point, but the shape of it is clearer than it first appears. The opening explains how Django becomes free. The winter section shows how he becomes capable. The trip to Candyland forces him to use everything he's learned, not just as a shooter, but as someone who can control his emotions and perform under pressure. Then the plan collapses, and the movie appears to hit its natural climax with the first big confrontation at Candyland. Schultz finally can't stomach Candie any longer. Django's cover is blown, and the careful rescue dissolves into chaos. For a moment it looks like everything's about to be resolved in one massive gunfight, but Tarantino keeps going. That choice creates the film's most obvious structural wrinkle. After such a huge confrontation, Django gets captured, hauled off, escapes, and then returns to Candyland for a second ending. It can feel like the movie already had its climax and is now building toward another one simply because Tarantino wants a bigger, more triumphant final image. At the same time, that extended ending finishes Django's arc in a way the first confrontation never could. Up to that point, Schultz has been the one making the plans, running the negotiations, and providing legal and social cover. Django has grown highly capable, but he's still operating inside someone else's strategy. Once he's alone, he has to escape through his own wits, choose to come back, and finish the rescue without his mentor. That second mission is far simpler and no elaborate business pitch. No need to earn anyone's trust. Django already knows everything he needs, and the people at Candyland now know exactly who he is. With the careful plan in ruins, he replaces it with straightforward retaliation. The result is structurally a little messy, but emotionally it's crystal clear. What began as Schultz buying Django for information turns into the story of Django earning the skill and independence to free himself completely. Broomhilda remains the goal holding everything together, but the road to her is also his education. He starts the film in chains, follows Schultz through the middle stretch, and finally returns to Candyland as the one calling every shot. The bounty hunting, the false identities, the two-part climax all make the film feel longer than it strictly needs to be, but trimming too much would undercut the sense that Django has genuinely earned his transformation. By the time he comes back for Broomhilda, he's no longer the enslaved man Schultz happened to free on a dark road. He's become the one thing Candyland was never built to survive. The hardest thing about Django Unchained is also what gives it so much energy. Tarantino takes one of the ugliest chapters of American history and drops it into an exploitation movie. He doesn't treat the subject like a conventional historical drama. There's no attempt to keep the film calm, respectable, or emotionally restrained. Instead, slavery becomes the foundation for a revenge western full of comedy, swagger, theatrical villains, and absurd amounts of blood. That's bound to make people uncomfortable, and honestly, it probably should. For some viewers, the whole premise crosses a line as the suffering of enslaved people is real historical trauma, and while the film is deliberately entertaining, it asks its audience to laugh, enjoy the gunfights, and cheer as Django starts killing the men propping up the plantation system. There's always a question hanging over that approach. Is the film confronting slavery, or using it to make the revenge feel more exciting? The honest answer is that it does both. Tarantino absolutely leans on slavery's cruelty to build villains audiences will want to see punished. Calvin Candie and the men around him aren't written with much interest in redemption. They exist to embody a system so casually evil that violent payback starts to feel emotionally justified. The more the film shows of Candyland, the less patience we have for anyone keeping it running. At the same time, not every act of cruelty gets the stylish treatment. Some of the film's most disturbing scenes go noticeably quiet. The hot box sequence, for instance, is hard to watch precisely because Tarantino briefly strips away the playfulness that usually defines his direction. There's no punchline waiting at the end of it. Broomhilda is pulled from a device designed to break her, and the muted reactions around her make clear just how ordinary the treatment has become on this plantation. That normalcy matters. Candie doesn't act like a man who thinks he's doing anything unusual, and neither do his employees. Buying, selling, and beating human beings has simply become business as usual for everyone in this world. The horror isn't just that the violence happens, it's that people with power have built entire routines around it. The Mandingo fighting scenes push this further still. Men forced to hurt each other for the amusement of people who view them purely as investments. Tarantino films it aggressively, but there's none of the satisfaction that comes with Django's later gunfights. The violence belongs entirely to the slaveholders, and that shift in ownership changes how the audience feels watching it. When Django eventually turns violence back on these people, The whole style changes. Blood flies, bodies fly. The action pushes so far past realism it becomes fantasy. The separation feels deliberate. Violence used to control enslaved people reads as ugly and degrading, while Django's violence plays as liberation, even though it's every bit as brutal physically. That distinction doesn't erase the discomfort, of course. A revenge fantasy can provide catharsis, but it can't undo the history underneath it. Tarantino clearly isn't suggesting one unstoppable gunslinger could have solved slavery with enough bullets. He's imagining the kind of victory history never allowed, then delivering it with all the swagger of an old Western legend. That's where the film connects most directly to Inglourious Basterds, in which Tarantino rewrote the ending of World War II to hand his characters an impossible act of revenge. Here he's doing something similar with the American slave era, taking people history denied power and granting one of them near-mythic control over his own story. The fantasy is personal rather than political. Django never sets out to start a movement or free every enslaved person he crosses paths with. His mission is Broomhilda, and everything else is secondary. That narrow focus makes the story easier to follow emotionally, but it also introduces a moral wrinkle the film never fully resolves. Django lets other enslaved people stay in danger at times because intervening would expose him. During the Candyland performance, he behaves cruelly toward people trapped in the very system he escaped. He understands their suffering better than anyone in the room, yet he still treats it as part of his disguise. It's genuinely uncomfortable to watch, because his role demands more than silence. He has to convince Candie he belongs among men who buy in great human beings, and any hint of sympathy would make him suspicious, so he buries it. Freedom, in those moments, doesn't automatically make him noble. It just gives him choices, and some of those choices are ugly. That's what keeps Django from becoming a spotless symbol of justice. He's heroic in what he's fighting for, but the film never pretends every decision he makes is selfless. He's willing to let harm continue if it gets him closer to Broomhilda. His revenge feels justified emotionally, but it's also deeply personal rather than righteous in any broader sense. The film's racial language adds another layer to the debate. Tarantino doesn't soften how these characters talk. Slurs come up constantly, not just during violence but in ordinary conversation, underscoring how thoroughly racism is baked into this environment rather than confined to a handful of openly monstrous men. There's logic to that choice. A film set in plantation society would ring false if everyone spoke with modern sensitivity, and the casual language reinforces how completely black characters are stripped of dignity in this world. Racism here isn't isolated bad behavior, it's the social order itself. Still, the sheer frequency can feel provocative for its own sake. Tarantino has always been comfortable writing this kind of language, sometimes more comfortable than parts of his audience are willing to accept, and that history makes some viewers question whether every instance is necessary or whether he occasionally enjoys the shock value. The dialogue isn't authentic in every other respect either. Characters often speak with a modern sharpness or comic rhythm, since Tarantino consistently favors personality over strict historical reconstruction. That makes the case for the racial language's authenticity a bit shakier, since other parts of the script are freely stylized whenever it suits the scene. It's one of the film's built-in contradictions. It wants both the freedom of fantasy and the weight of historical truth. It wants Django to feel like a legendary Western hero while insisting the suffering around him carries real weight. Sometimes those two goals reinforce each other, other times they seem to be fighting for control of the same scene. The film's version of the South also pushes back hard against the romantic plantation imagery of old Hollywood. Candyland looks impressive, but there's nothing noble underneath. The mansion, the fine clothes, and the formal dinners exist because enslaved people are being exploited just outside the frame, and often right inside it. Candie likes to present himself as a cultured gentleman, but his wealth and authority rest entirely on cruelty. His interest in European manners and intellectual conversation doesn't civilize him. If anything, it makes him more unsettling, Since he's educated enough to dress up his violence but not humane enough to question it, Steven adds an even more uncomfortable layer. The film's racial conflict isn't neatly split between white oppressors and black victims. Steven is enslaved himself, yet he's built his identity around protecting Candie's power. He watches the plantation, distrusts Django, and defends the very system that grants him a limited authority over others. None of that excuses the white characters or implies everyone shares equal blame. But Steven has survived inside a structure he didn't create so successfully that upholding it has become part of who he is. He recognizes right away that Django represents something dangerous, not just an attempted rescue, but a black man refusing to occupy the role Candyland has assigned him. Django destabilizes the plantation before he ever fires a shot. He rides a horse, wears expensive clothes, and speaks to white men as an equal. The film knows exactly how powerful those images are in this world. His confidence is itself an act of rebellion. That's also why Tarantino leans so heavily on Western mythology. Traditional Westerns typically feature a lone man riding into a corrupt town and restoring order through violence. Django Unchained takes that familiar fantasy and hands the role to someone the genre's historical world would normally have denied even basic freedom. It's not a realistic portrait of slavery, and it never pretends to be. It's a violent correction written in the language of the movies. Django can't undo what actually happened, but within this invented world, he can walk into the plantation, survive its attempts to break him, and leave with the person it tried to take from him. That reversal is exactly why the revenge lands so hard. The film spends so much time depicting a society built on ownership that watching Django refuse to be owned becomes satisfying long before the shooting even starts. Every decision he makes, every weapon he picks up, every room he walks into challenges the rules around him. Whether that adds up to a powerful condemnation of slavery or a reckless exploitation of it really depends on the viewer. There's evidence for both readings. Tarantino clearly approaches the subject with real anger, but he also treats it as raw material for entertainment, staging scenes of genuine pain and then surrounding them with jokes, music, and sudden bursts of violence. It's an unstable mix, occasionally careless, never entirely comfortable, but it gives Django Unchained a perspective completely different from the solemn historical dramas usually made about this era. The film doesn't just ask the audience to mourn, it gives that anger somewhere to go, even if the destination is a blood-soaked fantasy. Django's arc works because the film never begins by treating him as the unstoppable hero he eventually becomes. When we first meet him, he's barefoot, injured, and chained to a line of other enslaved men, with no control over the road he's walking, the people around him, or even the direction of his own life. For those opening minutes, he's spoken about far more than he's spoken to. Then Schultz shows up and asks him a question, and simple as it sounds, being asked what he knows is already a shift. Schultz needs him because he can identify the Brittle brothers for the first time. His memory and experience have value beyond what someone can extract from his labor. The arrangement is still uncomfortable, since Schultz technically buys him before setting him free, but it cracks open the first real space for Django to start making choices of his own. Jamie Foxx plays these early scenes with very little dialogue. Django mostly watches, trying to figure out what kind of man has just entered his life. He doesn't relax simply because Schultz is polite or claims to hate slavery. Why would he? Every white man he's ever known has existed somewhere inside the same system, and even if Schultz turns out to be different, Django has no reason yet to trust that. Fox keeps him physically guarded, his shoulders tense, his expression controlled, his responses direct. This isn't a character waiting to deliver a big speech about freedom. He survived by reading situations carefully, and the film lets that instinct stay visible even after his chains come off. His first real step toward becoming the Django we remember comes with the Brittle brothers, not random bounty targets, but the men directly tied to the abuse he and Broomhilda suffered. That confrontation gives him something Schultz's paperwork alone can't. A chance to answer personal violence with violence of his own. For Schultz, Killing them is business. A face is on a warrant, dead or alive. For Django, it's intensely personal. He's not identifying criminals so someone else can collect a reward. He's standing in front of men who once held total power over him. Except now the balance has flipped. Django holds the weapon, he has the authority, at least on paper, and the men who once saw him as property finally have to look at him as a threat. That reversal becomes the rhythm of the whole film. Almost every stage of the story hands Django something he was previously denied: a horse, money, clothing, a weapon, a profession, and eventually the power to decide where he's going. The movie takes care to show how strange these ordinary freedoms feel to him. His near childlike excitement when Schultz tells him he can pick his own clothes matters because he's spent his entire life with no control over even the most basic parts of his identity. The first outfit he chooses is wildly flashy, and the film doesn't play it as a mistake. He's been handed freedom with no instructions, so of course he expresses it loudly. The bright blue suit gets a laugh at first, making Django look like he's dressed himself out of an imagination that's only glimpsed wealth from a distance, but Tarantino frames him with total seriousness anyway. On horseback, armed, dressed in bright colors, he becomes an image the people around him can barely process. A black man riding freely through the South already offends the social order. A black man in expensive clothes, carrying a gun, and looking white people in the eye feels almost impossible within it. Tarantino presents him less like a historically grounded figure and more like a superhero making his entrance in costume, and the exaggeration is intentional, because Django's freedom is meant to look disruptive, since in that world it genuinely is. His clothing keeps evolving alongside his confidence as the loud blue suit eventually gives way to the darker, cleaner look of a Western gunslinger. And his posture shifts too, growing steadier in the saddle, surer with a weapon, less inclined to wait for Schultz before acting. None of this comes through some inspirational training montage, we just watch him get better. Schultz supplies the practical rules of bounty hunting, but Django brings his own survival instincts into the partnership. He already knows how to read danger. What Schultz really gives him is a legal framework where violence against white men can suddenly earn him money instead of punishment, and when that realization lands, his reaction mixes humor, disbelief, and something much deeper. The system that once treated him as property now has a loophole, and he intends to use it. Even so, he never becomes Schultz. Schultz handles conflict through language, explaining warrants, performing politeness, circling a target until the other person realizes too late that the outcome's already decided. Django is quieter, he watches, waits, then acts. That contrast makes them an effective team, but it also keeps Django from disappearing beneath Waltz's far more talkative performance. There are scenes where Schultz clearly dominates the room, yet the camera keeps returning to Django's reactions at the almost boyish attention he pays when Schultz tells him the German legend behind Broomhilda's name, leaning in, absorbed by the story. Moments like that matter because they reveal someone underneath the hardening gunslinger persona. Django isn't driven purely by anger, he's driven by love, memory, and a stubborn belief that Broomhilda can still be found, a hope that survived even when the rest of his life was built to destroy it. That devotion gives the revenge story its emotional core. Without Broomhilda, Django might have just kept riding with Schultz, collecting bounties and enjoying the freedom that comes with it. But bounty hunting was never really his destination. Every skill he picks up eventually points toward one purpose. That's what makes him heroic in the clearest sense. He's willing to walk into an environment built specifically to strip him of power because the person he loves is trapped inside it. Candyland isn't just another dangerous location, it represents everything Django escaped: ownership, humiliation, the assumption that black people can be controlled indefinitely. But the film doesn't let his heroism stay entirely clean. To get onto the plantation, Django has to pretend to be a man who profits from slavery, posing as a Mandingo expert evaluating fighters for wealthy buyers. The role demands confidence, cruelty, and emotional distance say he can't just wear nice clothes and stay quiet. He has to convince Candie he genuinely believes in this business. That's where Django gets morally uncomfortable. He speaks harshly to enslaved people. He lets cruelty continue right in front of him. At one point, protecting the disguise means refusing to step in as another man is condemned to a horrific death, and Django understands exactly what's happening, arguably better than anyone else present, because he's lived through it. He chooses Broomhilda over him anyway. Strategically, the choice makes sense. Showing compassion would expose him and Schultz before they even reached Candie, and the whole plan could fall apart, leaving Broomhilda punished, moved, or lost entirely. From that angle, his silence is necessary. Emotionally, though, it's ugly. The film refuses to let him remain a spotless savior who always makes the morally ideal choice. Django has one mission, and he accepts that other people might suffer while he completes it. That separates him from the kind of hero fighting for some universal cause. He isn't trying to overthrow slavery nationwide, or even free everyone on Candie's plantation. His goal is his wife, and the limits of that goal grow more visible as the story unfolds. There's something selfish in it, though not in a way that costs him our sympathy. Django has spent his whole life having every personal bond dismissed as irrelevant, since the people who owned him and Broomhilda never considered their marriage worth respecting. His determination to get her back is therefore both intimate and rebellious. He insists their relationship matters even when the entire system insists otherwise. At the same time, he can be genuinely cold. Once the violence starts, Django doesn't hesitate much. Some of his targets are unambiguous monsters, and the film clearly wants us to enjoy watching them die. Others are simply part of the machinery surrounding Candie, and Django rarely stops to sort moral guilt into neat categories. Anyone standing between him and Broomhilda becomes an obstacle. This is where the classic Western hero archetype comes in handy. Traditional gunslingers are often quiet men driven by personal codes rather than public morality. They show up, identify who's responsible for an injustice, and settle it with force. Django fits that mold, but his history makes the familiar image feel entirely different. He's claiming a kind of heroism old Western cinema rarely handed to a black character. Jamie Foxx clearly understands that Django gets more powerful the less he says. Waltz, DiCaprio, and Jackson get the longer speeches and the flashier moments, so Foxx has to build much of Django's presence through stillness. A glance toward Broomhilda, the way he sits while Schultz tells a story, the change in his walk after months of bounty hunting. There's a real risk that this restraint could let Django feel overshadowed in his own movie, and at times it does happen. Schultz is more immediately charming, Candie more flamboyant, Steven louder and less predictable, since each of them is designed to dominate individual scenes. Django's arc, by contrast, plays out across the entire film rather than in one explosive monologue, and its importance becomes clearest once Schultz is no longer around to lead him. Up until the first confrontation at Candyland, most of the major decisions come from Schultz. He buys Django, proposes the partnership, tracks down Broomhilda, and dreams up the fake Mandingo deal. Django participates and grows steadily more capable, but he's still operating inside a plan someone else built. The extended final act strips that protection away. Once Django is captured and hauled off, he has no legal paperwork, no polished negotiator, no carefully constructed scheme. He has to talk the men transporting him into listening, find the crack in their greed, and turn the situation around entirely on his own. It's not just a display of marksmanship, it proves he's learned how to manipulate people through language too, not just violence. His return to Candyland reflects that shift. The first time, Schultz's plan is what gets him through the gate, and Django has to play a role and keep himself in check. The second time, he doesn't ask permission. He arrives on his own terms and announces himself as the person everyone should fear. Structurally, that second return can feel like a bit much. The film's already delivered one enormous shootout, and now it seems to be winding up for another ending. But from Django's perspective, the repetition serves a real purpose. The first assault marks the collapse of Schultz's plan, while the second belongs entirely to him. He decides who to confront, how to handle the people left, and when to burn the plantation to the ground. The mentor is gone, the disguise is finished, and the frightened man from the opening scene has almost completely disappeared. What's left is someone who can walk back into the place that once represented total power over him and reduce it to rubble. Even then, the film keeps his victory personal. Django doesn't stand in front of the burning plantation and deliver a speech about changing history. He reunites with Broomhilda, shows off a little because he's earned the right to enjoy himself, and they ride off together. That confidence is a long way from the silence of the opening scenes, but it's not really a different personality. Django was always observant, patient, and determined. Freedom doesn't magically hand him those traits, it just gives him room to use them. The film may speed up how quickly he becomes an elite gunslinger, but it takes his emotional progression seriously. First he follows, then he participates, then he leads. The moral ambiguity never really lifts. Django's enemies are cruel enough that rooting for him is easy, but his own methods aren't always gentle or selfless. He lies, kills, intimidates, and accepts collateral suffering along the way. He's capable of real tenderness toward Broomhilda and genuine affection for Schultz, yet he can shut off his empathy entirely when the mission calls for it. That contradiction makes him a far more interesting character than a simple symbol of uncomplicated revenge. Django is heroic because he refuses to accept the role the world has assigned him. He's morally uncertain because freedom doesn't automatically make anyone a saint, it just gives them the power to choose. And Django's choices are shaped by trauma, love, and a laser focus on making the people responsible pay. By the end, he's become the fantasy the Western imagery promised from the start, a lone gunslinger riding into a corrupt place, taking down the men who run it, and leaving with the woman he came for. The difference is that Django begins the story as the kind of person that genre and that era of history would normally have pushed to the margins. Here, he takes the horse, the gun, and the final shot for himself. It's a strange quirk of how people discuss this film that Django is obviously the central character, yet Jamie Foxx is rarely the first actor anyone mentions. That honor usually goes to Christoph Waltz, Leonardo DiCaprio, or Samuel L. Jackson, all handed louder personalities, longer speeches, and flashier showcase moments. That doesn't mean Fox is doing less, his job is simply different. Django spends much of the movie surrounded by men who love controlling a conversation. Schultz can spin a basic explanation into an elegant speech. Candie treats every dinner table like a stage built for his own amusement. Steven barely needs a full sentence to shift the mood of the room. Fox has to anchor the film center without competing with any of them on their own terms. He plays Django as someone who watches first. Early on his answers stay short and cautious, partly because he doesn't yet know what Schultz wants from him, and even after gaining his freedom he doesn't suddenly loosen up. He spent too much of his life in situations where the wrong word could bring punishment, and that instinct doesn't disappear just because one unusually courteous bounty hunter hands him a coat and a horse. Fox keeps that history present without ever announcing it. There's real tension in the way Django studies people. He rarely looks confused, even when he's unfamiliar with the world Schultz is showing him. He's calculating, listening, figuring out where the danger is and whether whoever's talking has already underestimated him. As his experience grows, Fox shifts the performance gradually. His posture firms up, his voice loses its early uncertainty, and he starts walking into rooms expecting people to get out of his way. It's not an overnight transformation. Even though his gunplay improves at movie speed, the confidence builds in pieces, and that patience is exactly what makes the later moments land. When Django finally takes charge, it feels like something that's been building beneath the surface all along, rather than a new personality suddenly appearing for the finale. Fox doesn't need a big speech to announce the change. The way he carries himself already says it. Still, it's easy to see why Waltz draws so much attention. Dr. King Schultz is practically built for his strengths. Educated, theatrical, endlessly courteous, and able to describe something horrifying in the same tone he'd use for the weather. Waltz gives every line a precise rhythm, clearly savoring the shape of the words as much as their meaning. In a lesser performance that could grate, but it works here because Schultz's politeness isn't just decoration, it's how he controls a room. He walks into hostile situations looking harmless, stays calm while everyone around him grows agitated, and waits for the exact moment his paperwork or his hidden weapon gives him the edge. Part of the pleasure of watching him is seeing him maintain his manners even once violence becomes unavoidable. He can shoot a man, explain why the man had it coming, and return to business without missing a beat, and that composure makes him funny as well as dangerous. Waltz had already played a similarly intelligent, talkative figure for Tarantino in Inglourious Basterds, which risked making Schultz feel like a friendlier variation on Hans Landa. There are obvious surface similarities at the controlled speech, the ability to run a conversation, but the emotional effect couldn't be more different. Schultz uses his intelligence to expose hypocrisy rather than protect it. He knows the law around him is deeply unjust, yet he also knows how to work that law better than the men who benefit from it. His paperwork becomes its own kind of weapon. People may despise seeing Django on horseback, but Schultz clearly enjoys reminding them that their own rules allow it. The relationship between Schultz and Django works because neither actor forces the friendship. At first, Waltz talks and Fox reacts. Schultz has the plan, the money, and the experience, and Django is useful to him but also dependent on him. As the story moves forward, that balance shifts almost without either character remarking on it. Schultz starts treating Django less like an assistant and more like a partner, and Fox grows more comfortable pushing back or acting without waiting for instructions. Their bond grows through shared work, small flashes of humor, and the simple fact that Schultz respects Django's need to find Broomhilda. They're also just fun to watch together. Schultz fills silence because he can't seem to help himself, while Django treats silence as a tool. One man talks his way toward violence, the other often looks ready to skip the talking altogether. That contrast gives their scenes a loose, natural rhythm. Waltz might have the flashier role, but Fox keeps Schultz from carrying the whole film away. Django's stillness gives the audience somewhere to rest while Schultz performs, and the two styles balance each other rather than compete. Then Leonardo DiCaprio shows up and the temperature of the whole movie changes. Calvin Candie is introduced late enough that the film has already settled into a comfortable rhythm around Django and Schultz, and DiCaprio disrupts it almost instantly. Candie is charming in the shallowest possible sense. He smiles, welcomes people warmly, and acts as though his wealth alone makes him fascinating, while underneath sits a man who's never once had to rein in his worst instincts. DiCaprio is especially good at capturing Candie's hunger to be admired. He doesn't just want Schultz's money, he wants Schultz to see him as sophisticated. He wants Django to behave according to the racial order he considers natural. He wants everyone at his table to accept that the conversation belongs to him. The trouble is he's nowhere near as clever as he believes. He collects fragments of culture, repeats ideas that sound educated, and surrounds himself with people who flatter him constantly. The performance grows more unsettling precisely because DiCaprio never plays him as a snarling villain from the start. Candie enjoys himself. He finds violence amusing and cruelty comfortable because no one around him has ever forced him to question either one. That easy smile does far more damage than constant shouting ever could, and when he finally loses control, the outburst feels less like a transformation and more like an exposure of something that was always sitting just under the surface. The manners drop away, and what's left is a spoiled, vicious man furious that someone made him look foolish. DiCaprio's performance also lands because it's so different from Waltz's. Both characters love language and see themselves as cultured men, but Schultz's intelligence is real, while Candie's sophistication is basically a costume. Schultz can walk into an unfamiliar situation and grasp the rules quickly. Candie needs to stay inside a world built to constantly confirm his own importance. Schultz's courtesy reflects discipline. Candie's lasts only as long as everyone keeps flattering him. Their scenes become a quiet contest between two men who each sense something false in the other, a Schultz pretending to want a fighter, Candie pretending his money and manners make him civilized, and both performances get harder to sustain as the film goes on. The dinner sequence gives DiCaprio his biggest showcase, and he makes the most of it, sliding between amusement, wounded pride, and real menace without any of it feeling mechanical. He clearly enjoys revealing that he's seen through the deception, since interest towards the sense of superiority he nearly lost. There's something almost childish about him, not innocent by any means, but emotionally stunted. He needs to win the room, and the moment he feels mocked, the business conversation turns into punishment. And just when it looks like DiCaprio might swallow the entire Candyland sequence, Samuel L. Jackson steps in and quietly reveals that Candie might not even be the sharpest person in his own house. Steven is one of the most uncomfortable characters in the film because the performance operates on two levels at once. On the surface, Jackson leans into the exaggerated mannerisms and speech of an elderly house servant, complaining loudly, hunching his body, reacting with almost theatrical outrage at the sight of Django riding beside white men. Some of it plays as genuinely funny, and Jackson clearly knows exactly how far to push a laugh. The film leans into the comedy early on, but that humor starts to feel different once it becomes clear how much power Steven actually holds. He's not just a grumbling old servant in the background. He watches everything, and understands Candie, the household, and the plantation's entire racial hierarchy better than anyone else on the property. Candie may own Candyland, but Steven is what actually keeps it running. Jackson gradually straightens the character out without ever making a show of it away from the larger group. Steven's voice firms up and his thinking sharpens, and the exaggerated servant persona starts to look less like habit and more like strategy, a role performed for so long it may no longer be possible to separate from his real identity. That's what makes him genuinely dangerous. Candie is too wrapped up in Schultz's attention to notice the connection between Django and Broomhilda. Steven catches it almost immediately, reading the glances and the tension and the subtle shift in Django's behavior around her. There's a sharp intelligence sitting underneath the comic surface, and Jackson lets it surface at exactly the right pace. Django wants his wife back. Everything else is preparation, disguise, obstruction, or retaliation. The film survives its length by continually reshaping itself. It starts as a road movie, becomes a bounty hunting adventure, tightens into a tense infiltration story, and finally erupts into revenge. Some sections land harder than others. The early stretch with Django and Schultz might be the most purely enjoyable part of the movie, with an ease to their scenes that makes the film feel lighter than its subject matter would suggest. Waltz gets to play with Tarantino's dialogue, Fox gradually grows into the Western hero role, and the audience gets to enjoy Django's newfound freedom before Candyland darkens everything. The Candyland material delivers the film's strongest performances and most serious ideas, but it's also where the pacing loosens the most. Tarantino lets DiCaprio, Jackson, and Waltz stretch their scenes because he knows they're magnetic to watch, and usually he's right. But occasionally the movie seems more interested in admiring the performance than moving the story forward. That's become a recurring pattern in his later work. His confidence as a writer has grown so strong that editing sometimes feels like an afterthought. His earlier films could be just as talkative, but the dialogue tended to feel cut down to its sharpest possible form. Here, some conversations keep going even after their purpose is already clear. It's not a fatal flaw. The performances are too strong and the underlying tension too real for that, but the looseness keeps the film from reaching the near total control of his best work. Pulp Fiction remains more formally inventive, its fractured chronology folded right into the experience, its conversations revealing character without ever announcing it. Kill Bill is more visually focused, almost entirely devoted to its own genre mythology. Inglourious Basterds is probably the closest comparison, since both films turn historical atrocity into revenge fantasy, and of the two, Bastards feels tighter and more cunning, its major dialogue scenes built like traps where danger lurks in every pause and the eventual violence feels both sudden and inevitable. Django Unchained is more direct, simpler emotions, a clearer objective for its hero, revenge that's more interested in satisfaction than surprise. It may not be as clever, but it's arguably easier to connect with. Django's drive to rescue his wife gives the film a personal through line that stays understandable even as Tarantino piles on detours. There's also a more straightforward pleasure in watching Django grow powerful. That might sound strange given the subject matter, but the film refuses to define its black protagonist purely through suffering. He experiences cruelty, humiliation, and loss. Yes, but the story also gives him style, humor, competence, and eventually total command of the final act. He isn't just someone history wounded, he becomes a Western hero inside a genre that would traditionally have kept someone like him at the edge of the frame, and that's one of the film's real strengths. The way it handles slavery is harder to settle on. Tarantino clearly despises the world he's depicting, and the film's most serious scenes carry genuine anger. Candyland is never romanticized, Candie's manners never disguise his moral emptiness, and the movie gives the audience every reason to want the plantation burned down. At the same time, it's still entertainment. Historical suffering becomes fuel for jokes, action, and cathartic revenge. The cruelty inflicted on enslaved people generates the anger that later makes Django's bloodshed feel satisfying. For some viewers, that's exactly why the film works. It refuses to let the audience observe oppression from a safe, solemn distance, choosing instead to convert anger into retaliation and hand Django the kind of victory history rarely delivered. For others, that same approach feels exploitative, using a real system of cruelty to fuel an exaggerated fantasy built for audience release. Pointing to Tarantino's intentions doesn't really settle the discomfort. Intention explains the style, but it doesn't automatically make every choice tasteful. The film is at its best when it acknowledges that discomfort rather than dodging it. Django isn't presented as morally spotless. Schultz's manners can't shield him from the reality of Candyland. Stephen complicates the racial dynamics by being both a victim of the plantation system and one of its most committed defenders. Those details keep the story from turning simplistic, even though the final revenge still leans on clear villains and emotional certainty. The performances do an enormous amount of the heavy lifting here. Christoph Waltz brings the film charm, rhythm, and a moral perspective more layered than simple heroism. Jamie Foxx has the quieter, less verbal role, but his restraint makes Django's transformation feel physical rather than constantly explained. Leonardo DiCaprio arrives late and instantly creates one of the ugliest characters of his career without ever letting Candie collapse into a humorless monster. Samuel L. Jackson may have the toughest assignment of all. Stephen is broad, funny, sharp, and deeply disturbing all at once. A performance that risks tipping into caricature but keeps revealing just how much awareness sits beneath the character's exaggerated surface. Kerry Washington gets the least material of the main cast, but Broomhilda still gives the story its emotional reason for existing. Without her suffering and Django's devotion to her, the film could easily collapse into a string of stylish killings. That ensemble is a big part of why the movie holds up so well on rewatch. Individual scenes practically stand alone as performances. Schultz laying out a bounty, Candie holding court at dinner, Stephen putting the pieces together, Django silently sizing up a room before deciding what to do. The soundtrack and visual design only add to that replay value. Tarantino's choices can be jarring, especially when modern music aligns head-on with Western imagery, but they're never timid, and the film leaves behind images that stick long after the plot details fade. Django in his blue suit, Schultz's enormous tooth-topped wagon, Candie's dinner table, the Candyland mansion consumed by the evidence of its own violence. Plenty of directors make cleaner films. Very few make films this unmistakably their own, which is exactly why calling Django Unchained self-indulgent works as both criticism and simple description. Tarantino keeps scenes a stricter editor might have cut. He gives himself a cameo the film doesn't need. He extends the ending well past a perfectly natural climax. He reaches for music because the clash of eras excites him, even at the risk of breaking the period's atmosphere. The frustrating part is that so many of those indulgences are genuinely entertaining. A more disciplined cut would almost certainly run shorter and smoother, but it would probably also lose the strange, sprawling quality that makes the film feel like an entire evening spent inside Tarantino's own private film history. The detours, the cameo, the tonal collisions are all part of the experience, even when they keep the movie from ever feeling perfectly shaped. The film's awards recognition for its screenplay and performances makes sense. There's strong writing and difficult acting throughout. Whether it belonged among the very best films of its year is a fair question. The ambition here is undeniable, but ambition and control aren't the same thing. Waltz is the easiest case to make for recognition. Schultz is written with remarkable precision for exactly what Waltz does best, and the performance gives the film much of its warmth. DiCaprio and Jackson get the more explosive moments, while Fox has to carry the central arc without nearly as much verbal fireworks to work with. Tarantino's screenplay shines scene by scene and is a good deal less disciplined as a whole.